Yeah, so my name is Andre Verdi. I work at the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and the objective of our organization is to help governments in times of large international crises to help coordinate the humanitarian response of international organizations that come in to attempt and hopefully alleviate suffering of affected people.
So I'm Kate Chapman. I'm the Executive Director of the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team. And we provide a base map that a lot of the crowdsourcing initiatives go on top of. OpenStreetMap is an online project with the goal of a free map of the entire world, which also happens to be very useful for disaster response. So OpenStreetMap has been around for about 8 years, and HOT itself has been around for 3.5.
So I'm with an institute called QCRI, the Qatar Computing Research Institute, and my mandate there is to develop free and open source humanitarian technologies by drawing on the expertise that my colleagues have in advanced computing, both machine computing and human computing. I think we're still trying to figure that out, right, Kate and Andre, in terms of what is digital humanitarianism and what it is to be a digital humanitarian. So I think there are different flavors of perhaps of that particular answer. I think for me it's the ability to support formal established humanitarian organizations on the ground by carrying out a number of different tasks online and by collaborating online to support, I guess, the information management processes and the information needs of established humanitarian organizations. And what's been clear over the past few years is you do not need to necessarily be on site to provide that kind of support, that you can do it via connection technologies and online. That's
Sure. So primarily what we do is we take satellite imagery. So imagine something you would see in Google Earth and allow people to define what things are in the images. So if it's a road or a building, is the building damaged, that sort of baseline information. The secondary part of it, or maybe even primary, is there's also already existing data in many places. So OpenStreetMap Philippines, for example, was pretty active to begin with. So it's a matter of now helping them update the data for how it's changed since the typhoon has gone through.
What we look for when we're producing either offline maps or enabling people with internet-connected devices that have mapping in the background, is we're always looking for the best source of maps, the best detail. I mean, that's our role, and to try to promote that to the community to use. And so in a case like the Philippines here, OpenStreetMap was clearly, had the best base layer that we could provide behind maps, whether it's showing damage, whether it's showing locations of camps or evacuation centers, and so on and so on. So we use that as a base layer. So having the volunteers make, Kate could probably give me the right numbers, but over a million changes to OpenStreetMap in a hurry really gives a much clearer picture of what's going on. Really improves that base layer for people to look at. So in many ways, this is what I describe this as well as many of the activities of the digital humanitarians, is we're really looking at this as a way to augment something maybe we already had. But the base map in this case may have been, maybe it would have been okay, but it's been augmented and improved significantly. And these are similar kind of concepts that we're working with Patrick on through the Digital Humanitarian Network to look at social media for information, and I had digital humanitarians scouring the internet for other information, which we then are starting to feed into existing products. So we're trying to augment things that are products that the responders are used to, so that isn't something completely brand new, and they aren't faced with new things to figure out during emergencies. So we're really trying to augment. We're adding a new flow of information, a new stream of information into things. So having the volunteers behind that, whether it's creating a better map, whether it's scouring through social media for us, finding that needle in the haystack, as Patrick likes to call it, it's really pulling those bits and pieces together to give it a more complete picture for the responders. 10 years ago, information would come in by people either working that were already in country or hearing government reports, or people flying into the country, undertaking assessments for the government counterparts, and you would get that little bits and pieces of information that way, as well as a bit from the media. What we're looking at today is the fact that we should be able to go through social media and various online media sources to get a picture, depending on the event. But like in a typhoon, almost as things are unfolding, things like an earthquake, maybe it's very quickly afterwards. But we should be able to get a preliminary picture within possibly hours that wouldn't be a complete picture, but would help people maybe when they're going in to undertake assessments to make sure that they're a little bit more precise or a bit more targeted. Because if there's areas that they can see that looks like significant amounts of damages through pictures or videos, well, do they really need to go there to assess? Or is the area that's completely black on the map where there's nothing showing up, maybe that's even worse, or maybe it's better. But it allows them to, let's say, make more informed questions so that they, so we can get this picture significantly quicker. We can add to, so if somebody's jumping on the plane to go into the country like the Philippines on the day of the typhoon or day after, hopefully we can put something into their hands, when they land or before they even get out to the affected area. So I see that we should be able to speed up the initial analysis significantly. Then over time, as we had this time with the digital humanitarians, they were collecting a variety of information for us around projects and activities that OCHA has to do on information management, and those were being fed into our existing products and services. And I had a conversation with one of the big donors today, and around just understanding what assessments that had taken place, and they were making comments about this is the best collection of assessments they had seen after such a major emergency, and that part of that list of assessments were being collected from public internet sources by the digital humanitarians, and then sending those to us through a structured manner, and then we were adding those to what we call an assessment regime. So people doing surveys, and we were collecting, so we're getting a much more complete picture faster than we usually would in the past.
Formal humanitarian organizations 5-10 years ago, the name of the game was, during a disaster, there was a scarcity of information, and that was the world that established formal humanitarian organizations operated in, and that's how their systems were geared towards managing scarcity, and now we have an overflow of information. And I think what we've all realized over the past few years is that an overflow of information can be as paralyzing to humanitarian response as the absence of information. And what these digital humanitarian networks, volunteers, and individual groups do is provide filters to make sense of this overflow, whether it's an overflow of satellite imagery, of social media, and so on. In terms of a very small part of the digital humanitarian network's response at OCHA's request during the first few days of the typhoon making landfall was the use of this micromappers tool, which is still very much under development and was far from perfect. Some serious server issues and all kinds of frustrating things that happened. But in any event, we were able to collect about 250,000 tweets during the first 72 hours, 48 hours to 72 hours. We used some automated algorithms that a colleague of mine applied to filter for relevancy and uniqueness, and that helped us boil down 250,000 to about 55,000 tweets. And we uploaded those to micromappers, and in a period of about 5 days, we were able to go through about 30,000 of those tweets, and then based on that, geolocate the ones that were considered sort of more informative. I wouldn't even say necessarily actionable, because that's a lot to ask for sometimes, but at least informative, and going to what Andre was saying, sort of augmenting situational awareness. And so it was both great because volunteers were very excited with this new interface to be able to just do microtasking on the fly, clicking. At the same time, it was frustrating because for about 12 hours the system was down, and those are 12 hours that we would have liked to have. And so, we learned a few things, and we're going to go back to the drawing board, and we've gotten some good feedback. In addition to that, we were also tagging images, and by severity of damage captured by each image. And we still have a long ways to go. And it's easy to really get excited, and there's a lot of hype around these things as well. So, yes, we did something perhaps innovative, but it was not perfect. The good news is that the things that were not perfect are totally fixable, and that's what we're doing right now, is to fix those.
Our primary focus with training is usually people who live in disaster-prone areas. So, for example, I'm speaking to you from Jakarta tonight, where we have a program to working with the Indonesian government and the Australian government to help people map their communities before a disaster. The big thing with the digital humanitarian response, though, is the OpenStreetMap tools have gotten a lot better in the last couple of years. So since the typhoon, over 1,500 people have contributed information and made over 3 million map edits. If you look at our first major response, which was the earthquake in Port-au-Prince in Haiti, after a month, only 600 people had contributed. And it was far more difficult for new people to get started. So the biggest part is the technology being easier more than anything else. We have a learning website called learnosm.org, which has easy step-by-step instructions. And if someone really needed help, one of our volunteers, I'm sure, would help them. We have a mailing list and also live chat through IRC as well. And you can ask us for help on Facebook or Twitter. So there's many ways to reach out to us, and we can help.
I mean, what's matured, and as Kate has said, the fact that technology is becoming significantly easier for people to engage, whether it's volunteers or even professionals. And I think as these networks have become more formalized and established, I mean, Kate talked about, I think, 600, versus now there's 1,500. And, as we get more and more attention to these things, and the groups like micromappers and the various members of the Digital Humanitarian Network are really sort of, I think, many of them formalized. Some existed, but many formalized a lot more after Haiti, realizing that they could contribute. So groups like Translators Without Borders, Statistics Without Borders, and DataKind, these groups really trying to formalize, makes it significantly easier for the formal organizations to interface. Right before, and as much as it sounds like a joke, I remember being approached by somebody from a large international organization asking me, how do I call them the volunteers? And they said, do I just send an email to Patrick Meyer? Is that the way it works? So people didn't have the understanding of how to interface. So it's a combination of setting up groups that are becoming well known, but the Digital Humanitarian Network was really aimed at being an interface to help facilitate at least the understanding of how some interaction would happen. But then the technology, as Kate talked about, OSM has improved, I think, significantly and made it much easier in the last few years. Patrick had talked about the micromappers, which in many ways is, significantly younger, but has improved in an amazingly rapid speed. So I think as these things become easier and easier to use, more people can really engage. And it's also quite interesting, several companies have approached me here in Manila, wanting to contribute their software and their engineers, and people are really starting to get interested in engaging in disaster response. And I think that will really help streamline, a variety of things, just not from the coordination angle, as what we're talking a little bit about here from my side, but helping with logistics, and supply chain management, to just logistical moving of goods, optimizing how and how many people should be in types of different facilities. I came across a group that was, an architectural volunteer group just recently that is, in country helping out. So we're really getting some, interesting groups that can engage constructively, and I think that's one of the big things that's changing. And as more and more of this happens, the formal organizations are starting to understand that this can help and can augment, and becomes much less of a fearful thing, because they see it in Haiti and they didn't understand it. And now as more and more constructive projects are happening and showing very positive results, people are much more willing to have that discussions, usually outside of the emergencies, but willing to have those discussions and figure out how do we start collaborating and working with these amazing volunteers around the world to help us improve and augment in their response.
We're all learning. This is, I don't think none of us have all the answers, and there are a lot of questions, and we're trying to figure them out as we go along. So it's a lot of learning by doing. I don't think we have much of the luxury of just staying in the lab for a year and then coming out and saying, oh, we have the perfect solution, only to realize that the world has changed. What excites me a lot is local communities that are now more perhaps tech savvy in certain countries, in certain regions, these local sort of digital villages that mobilize a lot faster than perhaps even us on the outside. So that's neat, and I hope to see more of that. I think that'll be a source of innovation and learning for us, as well as an opportunity for us to share with these local tech-savvy communities what we've learned over the past few years. So ultimately, if we could have very localized digital humanitarian groups that respond first as the first digital responders, and then are backed up by sort of the international digital humanitarian network when need be. That would be an exciting sort of development, and not only just online digital local humanitarians, but also the offline. We also see folks on the ground. We know that the first responders, by definition, are the affected communities. So both offline and online, I think we'll see more agency, we'll see more examples of innovation at the local level, and we hopefully will be in a position to learn and support that.
I wanted to echo Patrick about the engagement between the local communities and the international groups. For us, we've been working very closely with OpenStreetMap Philippines, and we have multiple times when there's been typhoons or cyclones. But I think the biggest difference will continue to be the tools improving and more people being able to engage. They're getting easier and easier, because the thing is, everyone doesn't have to be an expert for example. Like with OpenStreetMap, anyone can learn to look at satellite imagery and interpret it, but how do you enable people to do that more easily?
I think it's Don Tapscott that says, let's not predict the future, let's build it together. I think that's a key point. But I think both, reiterating what Patrick said and Kate said, the fact that these sort of local, much more local digital villages, whatever we want to call them, in a variety of countries will start to really pop up. I mean, I'm here in Manila, and I've been in touch with actually several small independent groups. These are very tech savvy young groups, young tech companies, young volunteers, and they can do a lot, and they can do it fast. And they sometimes aren't burdened by the same kind of rules and regulations or historical baggage that governments or agencies or so on, and so they're really willing to try things. So I think that's we'll see a lot of innovation out there. It'd be really great to see some kind of where the digital volunteers locally are responding, and we can really support remotely in some kind of way. So I think we see an expansion both in that direction and also in the digital humanitarian network. On the global side is really growing. They're really they've added a few new members recently, really looking at expanding. And I think there's a lot more, big private firms even that are interested in joining and bringing a lot more power, especially in the back end to these responses. So I think there's a lot of potential in the future. Where it goes, I'm not sure. From my side, I really want to keep directing it to, at least in the short to medium term, into augmenting what's already existing, and then we slowly introduce, the new tools and new approaches, so that we don't scare anybody, and but we keep, improving over time.
The final thing I wanted to address was really the hardware challenge, if you like. So, I mean, we had this tremendous capacity to share information and crunch data, but when disasters strike, it often knocks a lot of that out. And I wonder if all of you who've been working at this for a while could give people an idea of how people are working to get that up and running again, and the ways in which that sort of reestablishes itself in the wake of a catastrophe.
Obviously, this is not a surprise to disaster responders who work in major disasters, in response to major disasters. It's almost expected, I imagine, I think, to have telcos go offline and lack of cell phone coverage. I was talking to Kyla Reed, who is GSMA's disaster response lead, and she just came back from the Philippines. And what's interesting there is that it's not just the telcos going offline, it's that people have physically lost their phones. With everything that's happened, and the shelters being completely razed to the ground and so on, people have they might have kept their SIM cards, but they've lost their cell phones. So what's happening now with the telcos and others are trying to find out how to get people phones back, new phones and so on. And a lot of people who are going to the different centers, to the telephone centers to make calls, are actually asking to use their own SIM cards so they can pull up the address book and so on. It's an issue. It's an issue, I think, for mobile operators. It's an issue for GSMA and their disaster response program to understand how to make their communication infrastructure more resilient, so that they do come back online as quickly as possible, and then to also have plans B, C, and D, in terms of enabling groups to continue the ability to communicate. And I know Télécoms Sans Frontières are doing some important work in there, as well as other groups. It certainly affects, I think, a lot of what we do in terms of trying to collect information from those disaster-affected areas. And I think, as Andre hinted as well, these sort of what I call negative spaces, those areas where you do not get, say, a social media footprint after a disaster, even though you see a baseline prior to, that's very informative. That tells you what your blind spots are, very, very quickly. It's incredibly how stark that can appear on a map. So, and understanding what the contours and the border areas between areas that do have a social media footprint and those that don't, those border areas can be very informative as well. They can you can infer sort of what might be the case in terms of disaster damage and so on in those negative spaces.
It's a big challenge, and it's been interesting. I was having a conversation with Kyla when she was in here, and had different feedback from the mobile operators here. They had built up contingency plans, and they had felt that they were really prepared. They were preparing for major earthquake type scenarios, and this one really was just significantly bigger than they had expected. And when you compare the typhoon, for sort of recorded history, it is the biggest. So they just, hadn't been sort of prepared for the absolute worst case, or worse than what they expected to be the worst case. So, getting these kind of things online has been difficult. But I talked to the teams that are down in Tacloban and these different areas, and they're still struggling. Yeah, maybe the mobile phones are there, and I have conversations with them once in a while. But even the international responders who are down there, who are being supported by an international humanitarian partnership group, which brings in like tents to work in and sleep in, and tries to source them fuel and generators. I mean, there's times where their machines and the internet just shut down because the power just is too low. And this evening, the IT group just had to shut everything down because the power was just wasn't there. So I mean, they just go offline as of about 9:30 this evening. So even with a lot of money and resources, it's very difficult. And that's not just talking about the phone. Now, in terms of the affected people, the men, the women, the children, Patrick talked about they lost their cell phones, but that's not the only way. So groups like Internews are really working with the local radio stations. With they're trying to get these back up in line, share the information that way. At the time of these crises, this is the affected communities. This is one of the biggest things, that they just want information, not dumps of information, but clear information about what's happening, what should they be doing, where can they find help in terms of food or shelter, these kind of things. And so there's there's a variety of ways that information can get out through word of mouth, through radio, through SMS if they have it available, and so on. And it's quite interesting. Patrick talked about this project of them trying to figure out how to get cell phones out to the affected, and I wrote a personal blog post about that a handful of months ago, and people thought I was a bit crazy, that we should maybe be looking at giving smartphones or cell phones as aid, and just proving a case where maybe that actually is something we should be really considering. So I think this is it's becoming more of a reality. I've talked to other groups about how we should be thinking about setting up mobile networks during crises, and there's temporary ways to do that. So I think helping the affected and sourcing information for them and getting it delivered to them through probably sources that they're used to, whether it's radio, whether it's the government channels, through SMS programs that have already been existing in country before, and it's going to be key. But of course, it all relies on a certain degree of technology to get that out there.